Hello there. Last week I made a video about tension and how you can use flashbacks to build tension or flash forwards, as one of my subscribers commented. This subscriber also said that I don't know how to write flashbacks, flash forwards. He asked for more details about how a flash forward or a flashback is written. So I decided to make a video about how the techniques of flashback, then integrate the mechanics of flash forward and flashback. Alright, so each story is comprised of two timelines. The actual timeline, meaning the events that happen within the story, event 1, event 2, event 3, event 4, etc. And we have the narrative timeline, which was misspelled as you all saw, and this is how the events are presented to a reader, the order in which these events are shown within the story. And well, as a rule, these events in a story, unless of course we're talking for avant-garde storytelling, go also in a series similar to how they happen within the actual timeline. However, it's not unusual when events are moved within the timeline. For instance, event number 2 can be presented before event number 1 is, and event number 3 appears only after events 4 and 5 are also presented within the story. And this is not some weird way to write a story. It's actually utilized very often. And there is a reason for that. So why do events appear in order different from the order they happened? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One reason is backstory. Backstory are events that have happened before the beginning of the story. However, they come up as we narrate because they're important to the story. For instance, our story starts with our hero who lives with his uncle and aunt. Past, his parents passed away, and of course he's a farm boy with destiny because it's fantasy. The way his parents passed is detailed somewhere later. It comes into focus later, and even though it happened before the beginning of the story, it's part of his story. And if we get to this event, the passing of our hero's parents, then we'll have this event relate later in the narrative. So we have this flashback or exposition. There are the two ways to refer to previous events. Another reason is because events that happened after the initial event of the story are relegated much later in the story because of narrative structure, because that's where they matter in the story. For instance, when our main character is waking up in his uncle's farmhouse and he's about to go and feed the horses, we had the evil assassin watching him from the shadows, or riding a horse to go there. While he was going there, he was delayed by the wise wizard who was also going towards the farmhouse to find our hero. But this is mentioned way later when when the villain meets the hero for the first time and say, "Oh, I was going to go to the farm and kill you, but this and this happened, and I was delayed." And later on, the good wizard may explain to our hero that yes, he did that to save his life, etc. This may be also done for tension, for suspense. There's a whole video about how this can be done. For instance, hiding an event or flashing forward to an event as a way to create tension. For instance, we can have our hero walking down a street and say, in 5 minutes time, I'm going to run and people will be shooting at me. But at the moment, everything is very normal in the street. And that creates a bit of tension because we have very explicitly told that there will be struggle very soon, and tension is created by struggle. And finally, it's because of the pacing of the story. For instance, there may be a lot of events happening from point A, from event 1 to event 5, but you have to go through most of them and mention them later, events 2, 3, and 4, just to keep a brisk pace for the story, or better get started after event 5 and then mention events 1 through 4 in more detail. That's in media res. There are two ways to refer to events that are out of order, and this techniques is the flashback or the flash forward and the exposition. The flashback or the flash forward, they're not different. They're practically the same thing, only instead of one is focusing on a previous event, the other is focused on an event to come. They're dramatic. We have the narration of events, we see how they happen, we have dialogue, we have action, we have all the stuff. In exposition, or also known as info dumps, we have just a recounting of these events as a fact or something like that. And the line is a bit thin. Basically, a flash forward or a flashback is a scene. Exposition is a synopsis of a scene. If you go into a condensed version of past event or a future event, then it's exposition, not a flashback or a flash forward. In visual mediums like on movies or TV, we'll mostly use flashbacks and flash forwards to explain stuff, or use exposition too, but makes for a poor drama. That's why flashbacks are important. There are two ways to relay these past events. A, the narrative voice, meaning that it is the narrator of the story. If the story is written in third person limited, then we have a third person limited account of what happened. However, there is the case where we have a character's narration of the flashback. For instance, somebody is explaining to our character what happened in the past. So for instance, we can have a third person narrative as the story structure, but the flashback is relayed in first person, told through the narrator. Actually, we have something called narrative layers. Each different narration is a layer used. For instance, our hero, may be the farm boy, may ask the good wizard how the Dark Lord came to be. And the wizard may say, in times past, I met the Dark Lord and I saw the sign, but he was a boy and I thought I can save him, and relay the story of how it came to be. Or it was his student and he had a vision and tried to kill him in a moment of weakness, and that created a whole war. Like in that movie. This sort of stuff. So we have layers, and actually an experienced writer can have layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of narration. But since this is a newbie topic about the mechanics of flash forward and flashback and narration, I suggest just two layers for this narration. And of course, there is a good case where the character's narration becomes the narrative voice in some way, especially in older stories. We had a character going on a trip, meeting somebody, and that somebody was telling them the whole story as he experienced it, or as it was said it happened. And this double layer created a sense that this story was real. It was something that was told to the character, so there was a bit of a suspension of disbelief. Edgar Allan Poe did that, Lovecraft did that all the time, and most of old writers from the 19th century and the beginnings of the 20th century used this device, and it's very common back then. For instance, in a modern setting, we could have our character talk, the hero talk to the wizard and say the wizard, oh, I remember like it was yesterday. And then on the next scene, we get to a third person narrative limited on the wizard and this kind of stuff. Writing is more art than craft. So lots of things work. It's not necessary to keep the narrative voice or the way the flashback is narrated set in stone. However, for beginners, keep things simple. And of course, flashback can be done within a scene. The scene starts and our character remembers something that happened before and relays that to us, or he's told the story within the same scene. It can come after a scene break as a separate scene, or it can be a multi-scene narration or flashback. And this depends on the side of the story. Really, a flashback is just a scene, but it's told out of its chronological, out of the actual timeline, in a different place in the narrative timeline than the actual timeline. And I'm sorry if I'm not clear, but I haven't scripted this video that well. I have some notes here, and if there are any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I'll try my best to answer them. As I said, flash forwards and flashbacks are pretty much the same thing. Let me give you some examples of fast forwards in pop culture mostly. For instance, Breaking Bad did a lot of flash forwards. It started season 2 with a huge disaster, the pool scene and very enigmatic scenes of a catastrophe that has befallen Walter's house, and that's something that happens in the end of the season. Same happens with seasons 5 and 6, and also I think season 5 starts at the beginning of the final episode of season 6. Breaking Bad was amazing. Another amazing example of flash forward was an X-Files episode called Clyde Brackman's Final Repose. It's one of the most acclaimed episodes in the entire series, and it's a masterful episode, and it's about a character detailing a prophetic dream of his death. And that's an amazing scene. If you haven't watched this episode, go watch it. An example of not a flash forward is the beginning of American Beauty. I've mentioned this beginning of American Beauty before. Kevin Spacey's opening monologue, but that's not a flash forward. That's exposition of a future event. That's the difference. When somebody states some facts about what's going to happen or has happened, this exposition. When it is described or shown to the reader, then it's a flash forward or a flashback. So how do we craft a flashback or a flash forward? There are 5 basic components to use, and it's important to use all of them, at least in the beginning, when you try to learn the rules. You can break the rules, again, that's everything I say, it's not a law, it's a rule. But in the beginning, if you don't know how to write a flashback, or you're trying to write a flashback, then follow the rules. The first rule you have to follow is you have to make a bridge between the present of the narrative, where the characters are, where the narration is, to the past event. For instance, let's go with the Good Wizard telling our hero of his first encounter to the Dark Lord when he was an orphan boy, about the age of the hero. Yes, I know it's cliché, but whatever, you all know this book or this movie because there's so many of them. The Good Wizard starts, I remember that day. It was as if it was moments ago. Back then, I was not certain. Back then, I didn't know it would be so important. So we know that from the get-go that we're in the past. And he may say it was 50 years ago. So we have this bridge. We have the present. We're in, a tavern, and he's sipping malt wine and explaining what happened to our hero. And he makes it clear to the reader and also the other character that this happened years ago. And that's very important because it's important to be clear where we are, what the reader is reading. The second component of a flashback is the setup, because we're thrown back in time or forward in time, so there is some disorientation. It's important for the reader to get an idea of when this happens. For instance, in our example, the wizard says, it was 50 years ago, a dark and stormy night. The town of Fantasyburg was asleep. Yet I felt an ache in my bones, blah blah blah. So we have a setup where 50 years ago in the slums of Fantasyburg, and it's night, it's stormy. He has a premonition that he's about to meet somebody powerful in magic, etc. So we have this setup, we know where we are. And the third component is we should have drama. And when I say drama, I don't mean that, either drama and stuff. I mean, something must happen, we must have a narration. For instance, he says the Dark Lord, who is a boy back then, he is I don't know, a peddler, a thief, and catches them, and there is some chase and dialogue, and he explained to the Dark Lord that you're a wizard, Dark Lord. Okay, what he said. So we have this drama, this dramatic event that's happened. We have some conflict, and also we should have some outcome of this dramatic event. For instance, in our example, after I talked to the Dark Lord, I went to his master and offered to pay for his service. Then I took him to the Maid's Academy. So we have this outcome. Why what we saw was important. Let me add something I forgot to do in post, that if you write a flashback and you cannot think of an outcome why it is important to narrate the stuff, then maybe you don't need to write a flashback. That's a quick rule of thumb. Of course, the author knows better. And that leads us to the fifth event, which is the bridge to the present. At the moment, we have, at this point, it's probably the end of the scene, or the flashback or whatever. We get back to the present. We make clear to the reader that the past is past, now we're back where we left our heroes. For instance, in our example, the wizards say, the wizard look out the window. I still remember that day. Up to now. So we get a closure of this parenthesis. We get boundaries. We limit the flashback or the flash forward within two bridges, and we also set up and have an outcome out of it. Of course, a more experienced writer can omit some of these parts or make this part implicit. However, it's important for these distinctions to be here. And okay, in case we have multi-scene flashback, or we have whole story that is told in flashback, and just the present stuff is another narrative layer like we did in all stories, then of course this flashback shouldn't be in every scene, and sometimes we'll have brief pauses where we have bridges to the present as as a break, or to tell a second story, to have multiple plot lines, past and the future plot lines meeting each other. For instance, somebody narrates the story to a scary story to somebody else, and we're at some point go to the present, and we have strange noise happen, or strange expressions, or weird stuff because there's another jump scare after the story is finished in the present. And so sometimes we don't get the outcome exactly after the bridges, or we get bridges and all this complicated stuff. But you know what, that's out of the scope of how to build a flashback, and probably it's confusing if I go on this stuff. So what is important is that we have a flashback within boundaries, and something very important is that sometimes you don't need a flashback, sometimes you need exposition. You go for a flashback because you need to add drama to a scene to make it more interesting, to show, don't tell. Of course, telling is not bad sometimes, not everything has to be shown, and it's down to pacing, it's down to how the author feels about the story he or she is writing, how pacing words, how events should be relayed, and how important they are. And if you have something happening in the past that has been shown, it has to be shown later outside of its place in the actual timeline, and it's important. It's a good idea to use a flashback about this, and that's pretty much the mechanics of how to go into a flashback or out of a flashback, at least in my opinion. I haven't studied literature, so I may don't know the exact terms, but these are the mechanics of using flashbacks. Hope it was of help. If you have any questions or need any parts of this video explained, please leave a comment below. I'll do my best to answer in the best way I can. And of course, it's important you should read. I read a lot, and just keep these things we talked today in mind. And as you read them, you'll start to notice them and how they're done. And the more you see how flashbacks are done in books, and books from different eras, different genres, different authors, authors from different cultures, different genders, anything, just read a lot and you'll start to see how it is done, the exact mechanics, how they work, how they're utilized for different purposes, and this will give you the tools you need to write your story. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share if you think that this video was interesting, and I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching.